Well, hi Dan, welcome to the Product Leaders Podcast. How are things with you?
Hi Ben, thanks for having me. Very excited to be doing this. Really excited to talk some data product.
Yeah, definitely. This, I think we've been started talking about doing one of these probably a couple of months ago, or a few months ago when you just started at Tesco. Obviously, in our recording chat, you mentioned that you started to get to grips with things, which is great to hear. But yeah, very much looking forward to diving into the types of stuff you're currently doing and stuff you've done previously. I guess as a starting point, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on at the moment?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Delighted to. Not many people ask me. My name's Dan, very much Dan, not a Daniel, and I'm currently lead product manager for data and machine learning at Tesco, specifically within the cybersecurity domain at the moment, so sort of embedded with the cybersecurity teams. As you can imagine, Tesco's massive and there are lots of folk working across sort of data and machine learning. We're specifically working on helping to sort of leverage machine learning to help defend Tesco, right? So it's a massive business. It's got a lot of what you might call digital estate that's exposed to the wider world. And we're looking to basically leverage data science techniques, sort of models to help complement the existing defense regime. It's a new space to me. So when we talk about it, maybe there'll be stuff where I sort of outline what we're doing, but essentially it's all about removing the need to predict exactly what someone might do to attack the business, and instead to identify the kind of things that just look odd, which are often indicative of an attack on the business. So to give you an example, my colleagues will often say, yeah, so when this thing happened, we didn't predict it was going to happen. When you look in retrospect, it was obvious that something odd was happening. That kind of stuff is perfect for sort of the application machine learning, for anomaly detection. And so that's essentially at the core of what we're doing.
Nice. Sounds great. Sounds very interesting. And obviously, I've been truly important to most businesses, but as a big multinational company, it's probably more important. And so that sounds great. And cutting edge in terms of what a lot of people are focusing on at the moment, for sure. I'll jump straight in. Do you consider what you're building to be a data product, or are you not so kind of specific with your thoughts?
Yeah. So we're sort of blending the two, right? So I think what we're doing is sort of a very specific subset of data products, right? We're less in the surfacing insight and kind of powering decision making, and rather actually producing actionable decisions. So sort of taking it a step further than some of the more traditional data products, which often around sort of basically allowing people to make decisions. We are taking that step further and often making the decision ourselves. But it's no different in the sense that you are taking a set of raw inputs, you are sort of treating them, producing them, generating some sort of insight and mapping them to, and I think the thing that makes it a product is sort of business user needs, i.e. flagging that something needs attention, and then allowing people to plug into that to understand why it is that you've raised that and help them essentially do their job and then sort of address the jobs that they have to do as part of their role more easily, which I think is the core of what made that product piece of data product. So yeah, that I absolutely would consider a data product. It's not emblematable data products, but that would be that's a very broad church. That'd be very difficult to I think to say that you were doing everything in data product.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always think about data products as it's a data product when it's delivering value to the customer or whatever the kind of problem area you're trying to solve. I guess in this case, you gave quite a nice example right at the beginning, and you said how maybe something had happened, your colleagues didn't predict that it was going to happen, but having looked at everything else in retrospect, you should have predicted it was going to happen. I guess it's more, I suppose it's like particularly in the cyberspace, it's a proactive approach in terms of, it needs to be, because you need to predict that something's going to happen, rather than maybe in a more traditional environment, it might be, we're trying to solve this customer problem, let's try and build something to solve it, we'll find out from the customer what the problem we're trying to solve is first, whereas I guess in your case it's probably, we don't want there to ever be a problem, so let's predict that.
I'm not sure actually is that divorced from traditional, so I'm a great believer in the idea that like core product practice applies to data as much it does to anything else. So that is essentially, you're still identifying a problem or a task that needs to be done. You're helping, like you say, deliver value or sort of expedite the speed at which it's done, make it better, higher quality. I mean, for us, we're essentially, what we're doing is we're saying, well, a human being has got to be sat trying to figure out whether something's happening or not, which actually, when I started speaking to my colleagues and you sort of do your user interviews, it's intensely stressful. right? If you're thinking about essentially, you're just given remit said like, make sure that nobody's getting into our sort of digital estate and doing anything they shouldn't do. It's deeply stressful, especially when you layer on the fact that you're often tested, that you have all these other aspects in. And so what you're doing is you're still basically saying, well, what is it you're trying to do? What are the kind of things you're looking for? How can I essentially lift some of that burden? How can I make you more effective at doing that and give you the tooling that essentially allows you to do the really core aspect of your role, which is making a decision, which is, like, this is or isn't an incident where we need to hit the button, we need to lock everything down. And that's, I think in that respect, it is still sort of core product practice. And the solution in this case is, like you say, you want to make sure that you are really tuned up to the gills in terms of making sure that you are not risk tolerant at all. We take no risk, we'll lock everything up, but making sure then it treads the right balance with the business. So I think in that respect, it's still pretty traditional product in that you're still plugging into the user and delivering value and understanding their problems and their jobs.
For sure, yeah, I'd say your point. I think maybe my use of the word traditional was the incorrect word. It was probably more, maybe just some of the other conversations I have about data products and maybe a slightly different sort of approach. It might be, like a train line we've talked about on this podcast. Their kind of split save product is an algorithmic product which tags onto the back end of their kind of flagship mobile app, and it helps you decide whether to buy a return ticket or two singles, and that's maybe a little bit more like you presenting it to the customer in case they think it's useful, whereas I guess yours is, I guess it's just an interesting added layer of complexity that is defense and cyber.
I think you're absolutely right. There are, I guess you're getting into like the various issues of how one can go about leveraging, like it's say additional insight as opposed to making a decision, because I guess it's the core thing of making a decision as opposed to surfacing something. So in a prior role, I worked at a company that owns Total Jobs, and we were then much more in that space of essentially surfacing recommendations to users and helping them to understand what it is that had made the reason for recommending that role, to then understand if they were a fit or not, to understand some of the things they would need. And that, I think, is a bit more in terms of like essentially surfacing things that help people make decisions, rather than essentially like, I'll make a decision for you and you could sort of decide afterwards whether or not that's right. So it's a slightly different speed. It's quite fun as well. I feel quite empowered with it.
Nice. Yeah, I was going to ask if there's any, I was just interested to put in maybe some other example from your background. You obviously mentioned that Stepstone. Yeah, no, so your background is obviously building data products, I think, and analytics products more specifically. Yeah, maybe tell us a little bit more about some of those products and maybe how they differ.
Sure.
To what you're doing at Tesco.
So my favourite product that I worked on was what we would call offsite recommenders, or the offsite recommendations engine at Stepstone. There's the same core engine that sits under all of their brand. They, for anyone who doesn't know, Stepstone's a German company that owns most of the job boards that you know that aren't LinkedIn, Zing, or Indeed. And essentially, so Total Jobs, Milkround, City Jobs and stuff, there's a good stack of them. And they have a really, really good data product practice. A lot of very sharp people who often actually have data science backgrounds or backgrounds themselves and work in products. So I worked in the team that did offsite recommendations, which is 4 questions that you could boil it down to. Who should you send a recommendation to? When should you send it to them? What should you send them? And how should you send it to them? And when you break it down like that, it's really interesting, because you then can go about optimizing and deploying models that address each aspect of it, which is what we did then. So we had a product team that was set up around having embedded analysts and data scientists. So we had an embedded data scientist, 2 product analysts, and it was this really sort of fun environment where we always had 2 or 3 models on the go at the same time. Instead, it's sort of done at scale. You're sending kind of communications to millions of people every day, so you can A/B test and split test really effectively. And it was one where essentially we were able to do all kinds of fun stuff. To give you an example, I guess we had a case where people were struggling because it's a recommender, right? So it's a collaborative filter. I don't know, I'm sharing any secrets I shouldn't. With some other stuff over the top of an embedded space that lets you then essentially say, because you have looked at A, B, and C, you probably also are a good fit for D. However, you still get traditional user problems with that, which is things like, well, I don't understand why it is that you've sent me this thing, because, it's not necessarily intuitive to an end user who doesn't understand, I guess, job ontologies or anything like that. So naturally, you would still go through that traditional thing of talking to users, trying to understand their problems, surfacing that both quantitatively and qualitatively. So still pretty traditional product. And then going back to your data science team, saying, well, hey, users are complaining they don't really understand why it is they're being recommended something. Can we basically surface the reasons for it? And the answer came back, I remember, was one of my favorite conversations. It was sort of kind of. So what do you mean cloned off? Essentially, it's not a true representation to say that you're seeing this because you did A, B, or C, because it's a placement in a very complex space. But we can create something which essentially is very close to that by saying this is the action that is closest in our very high dimensional space to that. And then you go out and test it, you do your sort of prototype testing, you do all that stuff, and you take it from there. And it was a lot of fun because essentially you're applying really cool data techniques to, real world B2C end users scale and across geographies as well. Actually, we're doing this in Germany, we'd be doing this here in the UK as well. Who had users in Belgium, etc. So we're going to talk to all these people.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I like that a lot. I think that it leans really nicely into how you're delivering value to those particular customers. It's it's a really strong example, isn't it? Because obviously, I think the B2C world often offers that example a little bit more clearly because you can relate to that in a job search and how that might work and why that would be useful. So yeah, I like the example.
Yeah, I like that. I'm a little biased towards B2C, I think, in the sense that it also offers the volume opportunities that's a data professional, make your life quite a bit easier. Running an A/B test at B2B is hard, whereas, when you've got tens of thousands, 100,000, even 1 million users, it becomes an awful lot easier to do the sort of quantitative techniques that data professionals really look to lean on.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe this is a good product that we're going to talk about, a stepstone for this question. When you're coming up with, for example, that recommendation type product, how do you come up with the hypothesis? And I guess when do you see the values being delivered to the customer? Because I guess it's maybe just an idea that it might deliver value, but then it's not truly a product in my eyes or a data product until it is delivering value. So how does that kind of work, that phase?
Coming at me with the hard questions, and that's there's no hard and fast answer there in terms of there is no point at which you transition, because I'd say even with a hypothesis, right? So data products, I think, is quite an interesting one where often it requires a real sort of mixing together of sort of the expertise of data professionals and understanding what it is that's available with an understanding of the user problem, in that you need to go and you're doing your user interviews or you're collecting constant feedback or sort of another, you sort of basically form this sense that there is a problem in the problem space. Then you have to address, can this technically be done? Not only can it technically be done, is it worth doing with those two things together? At that point, you get to forming your hypothesis, and I think that whole process itself is very interesting. One where sort of you really benefit from having your really technical folks involved in that discovery process around understanding problems and user problems, because then enabling the back of their mind to start framing the problem and saying, well, actually, if we reach for these kinds of techniques, these are the things that we can do. I refer you back to the explanation example, right, where essentially it requires a very specific application of a technique to be able to do that. It could not be done in my head, nor could it be done in the UX folks' head. It had to be done in the data science team's head, but they need a real feel for the problem. So then you form your hypothesis and you've got something there. I am a great believer just in the idea essentially of test as often and as early as possible. And I don't think the data products should shy away from essentially techniques like fake it all, from concierge tests, from that kind of stuff, because essentially what you can then go on doing is building confidence in your hypothesis. And I think that's one where essentially you go about going down that process. So before you even touch the data, you say, well, what might this look like? You might have your designer mock up something which, this is what it's like. You might show it to 10 users or like that, I don't like that, this is unclear. And you start building it out from that. And that helps actually to parameterize your problem as well. So in essence, what you end up with is, there's all kinds of ways of framing it, but you have that, if you're interfacing with an end user, you still have that output, you know what you're gunning for. And then you can go about starting to develop the underlying engine that's going to deliver that as a data product. Now you might have some lightweight MVP. Commercial transaction is probably the gold standard there, where essentially is someone going to pay you for it? So in earlier part of my career, that was essentially, are you delivering value? And it's the mechanical thing of, is it delivering revenue?
I think that's very good explanation. So do you under the bus a little bit with the question?
That's a good question. It's a good question.
Yeah, I think, part of the reason for the question is because you then touched on quite a few interesting points, which I think people are always interested to hear about. And I think that, the first thing that came to mind was just when you're going through that process, at some point you have to have that kind of leadership buy-in or C-suite buy-in, whatever you want to call it. And, this hypothesis that you're testing and you think is a good idea, when are we going to see the value in it, and how can we show that as quickly as possible? So I think, I'm interested to know maybe the difference between maybe that kind of product at Stepstone versus now? Because obviously the role at Tesco, I suppose you've been brought in specifically to build something. I'm guessing that the C-suite, whoever has already said we need to do this, whereas maybe at Stepstone is a bit more of a we want to make this product better, go and test like quite a few different things. So I guess I'd just be interested maybe a little bit of comparison between that and how it relates to the more the senior leadership and their kind of buy-in.
Yeah, I think it's again a very interesting question, very broad, and I think there are quite a few dimensions to it which we could go down, which is the core difference of, say, a capability product, which is what I would call what I'm working on at the moment. So something that's purely for an internal customer base versus something that's, say, B2C, and then you've got new versus mature or pre-existing. So there's a few different ways we can cut it and look at it. I think I would probably pull on two different strings. The first is like I say, sort of like, I guess, stakeholder buy-in and interest, and the other is probably the role of frameworks and ways of understanding a problem space, because I think the two go hand in hand. Essentially, you need a really good problem space framework to both shape your own project, but also it helps as a mechanism, as a tool to get senior leadership buy-in. It's not the be-all and end-all, but essentially, if you can get them to understand your framework, then they're more likely to engage with not the details, but essentially what it is you're doing and how you're trying to get there. So I think if I were to trim at first senior stakeholder thing, both organizations work on sort of like OKR-based setups, right? Where you've got a very clear strategy, you've got some key objectives with related outcomes that they're looking to achieve, and fundamentally they're no different. Both are seen. One is you have a bit more of a freer reign to go about finding opportunities to push the boundary on, say, various points of the conversion funnel, like you have a Stepstone. So a lot of attention paid on the conversion funnel and understanding of basically all of the different steps that people go through, how that manifests externally for the business, versus strategically at Tesco, they're saying essentially we need to be able to essentially have this capability and de-risk this area of our business. And that is something which is not a traditional, that you can't apply conversion funnel type techniques to it. It is really about essentially removing risk. And so it's all about then boiling it down to metric. And at Tesco, our CISO put it very simply to me. He said, essentially, your job is to catch things that would not previously have been caught. And when you boil it down to like that, it's very simple. You're then given fairly free remit to do that, but you have to go about demonstrating, finding ways to demonstrate that you're able to do that thing, which is really, day-to-day fundamentally feels quite different from essentially, I need to go about and improve the conversion rate at this particular point in the journey by this. I can look at the funnel and prioritize that. I can show that to leadership and say, I think we should be focusing more on the early part of the experience or the very final bit of conversion around, say, a job application, rather than essentially.
Nice. I think that's great. I think that lots of leadership people, C-suite, whoever it might be, when people are building data products, are very interested in the ROI, specifically, the revenue, the actual financial part of what is being delivered in terms of value. I think the really important thing is that lots of discussions I have is people miss out that kind of middle stage where you're going back with what you rightly said, like the framework that you're using, giving some of the metrics, some of the conversion rates with the Stepstone example. I think, isn't it necessarily easier at Tesco, but I think it sounds as though you've got the CISO who is very bought in anyway, so there's not so much of an element to like keep showing all of that value, because like you've been brought in to do a certain job anyway, so he sees the value in bringing you in to do that.
I think that it's an interesting one though, because I guess part of it, and this is sort of at the core of a lot of proper sort of machine learning data science practice, is that there's no guarantee of success. There's quite a high degree of uncertainty attached. So you're right in the sense that there is serious buy-in to the successful outcome of the products that we're working on at the moment. However, then what you get is a lot of interest around how you go about mitigating some of that uncertainty, which I think is part and parcel of building any kind of sort of, I guess, say machine learning driven products, because you do not know that you're going to be able to achieve those outcomes unless you have like a degree of insight based on months rummaging around in the data, which sort of I personally don't have, but some of our team do. And so you still have that relationship aspect of you're trying to outline how it is, A, that risk exists, because I think you're essentially setting yourself up for a very nasty fall if you didn't outline that risk existed. And then B, how you're managing and mitigating that risk so you're still delivering those outcomes that the business really cares about. And I think frameworks still are then a very valuable way of going about doing that, and essentially making sure that's transparent and clear and you're plotting what you're doing against that. So yeah, it's still, I think it still has some pitfalls, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, for sure. Nice. I think that's really interesting. But I guess that very short question. So for Tesco, did you have any previous cyber experience, or is that a new
No.
role for you? Yeah.
So it's entirely new, and to be fair, the majority of the team that we've built have had limited prior experience. So for transparency, I have some sort of academic background in computer science, so some core principles, but nothing that is what my colleagues who have from 3 years working as cybersecurity professionals have. However, I think that that's not necessarily a blocker in that the core techniques and applications of what you're doing, so whether it's pattern finding, sort of outlier detection, those kinds of things, still apply, right? You're sort of reaching the similar sort of models, or trying to understand, you need to understand data distributions, you need to understand the quirks and nature of it, sort of provenance, quality, all of that kind of stuff. Whereas it's a nice sort of professional, perk in that you get to operate in a new space or a new domain and learn about it basically as you go about applying the things that you know well. And so I'm quite a big fan of and would advocate for people to move, I guess, industry domains. It can be a little difficult to persuade the interviewer that you would be able to deliver there, but I'm a firm believer in the idea that as long as you have a really good grasp of the fundamentals, then actually you can go and learn.
Yeah, nice. I like that idea, because I think lots of people stay in a similar type of world, and maybe that's just because, as you kind of said, it's difficult to convince the interviewer sometimes that you could transfer those skills. But I think it's certainly an interesting move. Obviously, it's still B2C at Tesco because you're selling to customers, but then obviously you're more internal facing by the side of things. So it sounds like it's got a bit of a B2B kind of feel to it, which is obviously pretty different to A/B testing with millions of customers. But no, it's really interesting. I think that people listening will take sort of value in that, or take comfort in that you can move industry to industry or domain if you want to.
And I think I would also, there's very value in being direct. So if you are interviewing and applying something, it can be difficult to land the interview. But when the question comes up, and it's come quite a few times, I also, when I was doing my latest job subject at FinTech as well, be direct, advocate for yourself as somebody who can go across and learn, sort of understand what it is you would need to do, but essentially outline the structure that you would put in place. Say, I'm going to learn these things, I'm going to take, whether it's courses or I'm going to network internally or whatever. Advocate and make clear that you are able to make that bridge, because if you don't try and engage with their default sort of mental state, which is probably you've not worked in this before, therefore you won't be able to do it, you won't get anywhere. But actually, people are often open to discussing it and talking about it. They might disagree with you, but if you don't ask, you don't get.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's different to just saying, I've not done it before, but I'll give it a go. Or I think I have transferable skills with no weight behind it. I guess you need to show you maybe done some research into that space, or that you have, you correctly identified the experience that you have and how you can transfer that. That's the important element, just from an interview tip perspective.
So I guess what I would share, so for my latest role, we were talking about sort of the problem space. And I think being able to outline, say, in this case, the role of false positives and how that can overwhelm people. So being able to essentially understand some of the core dynamics that applies to, say, data property. Oh, actually, your recall sound like it's out of whack because you're generating too many false positives and ones, and then results in a poor solution. Actually, that's something that helps to build confidence as well. So there are ways of going about doing it and using sort of tangible details. And I think, like you said, it's about doing a bit of reading beforehand, sort of understanding the space, understanding the kinds of problems they're likely to have. Because actually, if you're a good data professional, you're going to know sort of the core dynamics don't change, right? Like, you're able to reach for certain key metrics and understand the impact that they have. And if you can then frame their problem in that space, you're like, oh, it sounds like you're doing well on that front, well on that front, and go from there. And people's eyes really light up when you can do that. If you can't do it, then you struggle to connect quite so much.
Nice, definitely agree. We're coming to the end of the episode, but maybe it's just as a final question. Nice and broad, maybe not one you had loads of time to think about, but I guess what are you excited about in the next kind of year or so, next few years in the data space, or maybe something specifically that you're working on at Tesco? What are you finding exciting in the data AI ML world at the moment?
So I have got a little cross-grained here. I always find that the application of things that sat sort of like slightly behind the frontier stuff is the most interesting thing. So on a personal level, I'm loving using things like Cursor to do sort of learn some of the application of LLMs to day-to-day tasks. That's all a little fun. However, I think more broadly, when I look at the sort of explosive growth of the platforms that are allowing people to stand up sort of data science and machine learning applications themselves, And sort of when you look at the uptake of things like Databricks and Snowflake, I'm really excited to see sort of the data products that people will be building with those, which I think are going to flow through and change the way that we sort of go about interacting with daily tasks. And I think I'll go back and extend and change thinking. People are going to be investing in data because they're going to think that things like LLMs are the future, and that's where it's at, which may well be the case. There is a nice secondary benefit though, which is that hopefully you'll get a real boom in the quality of data and volume of data collected and stored and housed, and that will allow data professionals to then look at and say, well, given that I have these things, by the way, I can give you a better, essentially, price optimizer. And so when you start to go through the news, you see things, for example, around dynamic pricing. So actually, that's the kind of thing where once you put a volume of data, you're going to see pricing move around. I'm excited to see how it works. I'm not necessarily excited to pay more for specific products if it's purely applied as a surge pricing, but I'm quite excited about the idea that we're going to be making more informed decisions or more optimized decisions. I am a believer in the idea that most things these things have done are to sort of improve end user experience and often deliver more value. And I do think things like pricing optimization are something where everyone can benefit. I'm sure we all know someone who will very gladly wait until a certain time to book their flights because they've noticed that people's change around them. I think all of that kind of stuff, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the kinds of changes that you'll see from an explosion or an increase in the volume of data collected and the quality. Focus on quality as well is a big deal. So for me, that's what I'm really excited about. I appreciate it's quite high level and vague, but at the same time, I think it's unknown. At the same time, I think that things will turn around in a year's time. But that is derived from the volume of stuff that we're collecting and the quality which I think is going to be a happy byproduct of sort of the real frenzy that there is around, sort of the big LLMs.
Yeah, great. Sounds very interesting. And it's good answer, and it doesn't really matter that it's broad. It's dug into quite a few nice little areas there. I think that's,
Broad means I'm more likely to be right, I guess, is the so deliberately I'm excited about things happening. Maybe leave it even that broad.
Nice. Cool. Well, look, Dan, it's been great having you on. Really appreciated your insights, and I'm sure people find them very valuable. We'll look forward to keeping in touch, and we'll obviously add your LinkedIn and that kind of things to the episode show notes. Perfect. That, and people can connect and pick your brains on another interesting data product question.
Very welcome to. Thanks for having me, Ben.
No worries, still, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Have a great day.